In a world where first impressions can make or break careers, where split-second decisions determine destinies, and where the smallest details hold the power to transform lives forever, one young woman discovered that sometimes the most unexpected encounters happen in the most ordinary places. This is not just another military story. This is not just another tale of recognition or reward. This is the extraordinary true account of how a simple food service job, a hidden piece of personal history, and one general's keen observation created a moment that would echo through the halls of the Pentagon and change military protocol forever. What started as just another day serving meals in a military dining facility would become a story that challenges everything we think we know about second chances, hidden talents, and the power of seeing beyond the surface. Because sometimes, the most remarkable people are hiding in plain sight, serving food with the same dedication they once served their country, waiting for someone to notice what others chose to overlook. This is that story. This is how Maria Santos went from invisible to unforgettable in the span of a single conversation. Maria Santos had perfected the art of being invisible. Every morning at 5:30, she would tie her dark hair back into a regulation bun, slip on her crisp white uniform, and begin her shift at Fort Henderson's main dining facility. Her movements were precise and efficient as she arranged the serving trays, checked food temperatures, and prepared for another day of feeding hundreds of soldiers, officers, and civilian personnel who passed through the cafeteria. To most people who walked through that line, Maria was just another face behind the sneeze guard, someone who scooped portions of mashed potatoes and sliced turkey with mechanical precision. They saw her name tag, maybe offered a polite thank you, and moved on with their lives. But what they didn't see was the woman who had once commanded respect in theaters of operation thousands of miles away, who had earned decorations for valor under fire, and who carried scars both visible and invisible from her service to her country. The transition from military service to civilian life had not been kind to Maria. After 12 years in the army, including 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, she had returned to a country that seemed foreign to her. The skills that had made her invaluable in a war zone felt useless in the civilian job market. Her resume, filled with military acronyms and specialized training, was often met with confused looks from hiring managers who had no frame of reference for what she had accomplished. Depression had settled over her like a heavy blanket in those first months after discharge. The nightmares came regularly, jolting her awake with memories of wounded soldiers she had treated, of friends she had lost, of split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death. The Department of Veterans Affairs had offered counseling and medication, but the bureaucracy was overwhelming, and the wait times were endless. Meanwhile, her savings dwindled, and the pressure to find work became desperate. The job at Fort Henderson had been a lifeline, even if it felt like a step backward. At least she was on a military installation again, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of military life. The early morning reveille, the precise scheduling, the sense of order and purpose, these things provided a comfort that the outside world had failed to offer. But it was also a constant reminder of what she had been versus what she had become. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had worked in military dining facilities for over 20 years. She had hired Maria without asking too many questions about her background, perhaps sensing that there was more to this quiet, efficient worker than met the eye. Maria was grateful for the non-intrusive approach. She wasn't ready to talk about her past, wasn't ready to explain why someone with her experience was content to serve food instead of saving lives. The work itself was mindless in a way that Maria found therapeutic. There was something soothing about the repetitive motions, the predictable routine, the simple goal of ensuring that everyone who came through the line left with a hot, nutritious meal. It was a form of service, she told herself, even if it felt insignificant compared to the life and death decisions she had once made on a daily basis. Her co-workers were a mixed group of military spouses, retirees, and local civilians who needed steady work with good benefits. Most were friendly enough, but Maria kept to herself, eating lunch alone and declining invitations to after-work gatherings. She had built walls around herself, protective barriers that kept her safe from having to explain her story or confront the complicated emotions that came with her new reality. The customers who came through the line were equally diverse. Young enlisted soldiers reminded her of herself at 18, eager and nervous and trying to figure out how to navigate military life. Seasoned non-commissioned officers carried themselves with the confidence that comes from years of experience and responsibility. Officers moved with purpose, often checking their phones or discussing upcoming meetings as they selected their meals. Maria treated them all with the same professional courtesy, but she felt disconnected from them. They were active duty, living the life she had once known, while she was merely an observer on the sidelines. Sometimes she would overhear conversations about current operations, new policies, or personnel changes, and she would feel a pang of longing for the sense of mission and camaraderie that had once defined her existence. There were moments when she considered re-enlisting. The Army was always looking for experienced medical personnel, and her combat experience made her valuable. But the thought of going through the bureaucracy, of explaining her current situation, of potentially being deployed again, filled her with anxiety. She had given 12 years of her life to the military, and she wasn't sure she had anything left to give. Instead, she focused on the present, on getting through each day, on the small satisfactions that came with doing her job well. She took pride in keeping her serving area clean and organized, in being friendly but efficient with customers, in never running out of popular items during peak hours. These were modest accomplishments, but they were hers, and they helped her maintain some sense of purpose and dignity. The tattoo on her left forearm was usually hidden beneath her long-sleeved uniform shirt. It was a memorial piece, a beautifully detailed design that honored her fallen comrades from her last deployment. The centerpiece was a pair of combat boots with a rifle and helmet, the battlefield cross that serves as a temporary grave marker for fallen soldiers. Surrounding it were the names and dates of 6 soldiers from her unit who hadn't made it home. Below that, in elegant script, were the words, "Until Valhalla," a reference to the Norse Hall of the Slain, commonly used in military culture to honor those who died in battle. The tattoo had been expensive, taking several sessions to complete, but it had been important to Maria to carry these memories with her always. Each name represented not just a fallen soldier, but a friend, a person she had laughed with, shared meals with, and ultimately failed to save despite her best efforts as a medic. The guilt and grief were permanent residents in her heart, and the tattoo served as both a memorial and a reminder of her duty to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. Most days, she was successful in keeping this part of her past hidden. The dining facility was climate-controlled, and health regulations required long sleeves anyway. But, occasionally, during busy periods or when reaching for items on high shelves, her sleeve would ride up slightly, revealing just a hint of the detailed artwork underneath. If anyone noticed, they didn't comment, and Maria was grateful for their discretion. The routine of her days had become comforting in its predictability. She would arrive before dawn, help with the morning meal preparation, serve breakfast and lunch, clean her station, and head home to her small apartment where she would spend the evening reading or watching television until it was time to sleep. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was stable, and stability was something she had learned to value after months of uncertainty and struggle. What Maria didn't realize was that her careful anonymity was about to be shattered by a chance encounter with someone who would see past the uniform and recognize the soldier she had once been. Someone whose trained eye would notice the small details that others missed, and who would refuse to let a fellow veteran remain invisible in plain sight. General Patricia Morrison was scheduled to visit Fort Henderson as part of a routine inspection tour of military installations in the region. As the commanding general of the Army's Medical Command, she was particularly interested in reviewing the health and welfare services provided to both active duty personnel and veterans in the area. Her visit would include stops at the base hospital, family services, and, yes, the dining facilities where so many service members and their families gathered for meals. The general was known for her attention to detail and her genuine concern for the welfare of soldiers at all levels. She had a reputation for speaking directly with enlisted personnel, for asking probing questions that went beyond surface-level briefings, and for remembering the names and stories of the people she met. It was this combination of professional competence and personal compassion that had earned her the respect of everyone who served under her command. As Maria went about her morning routine on what she thought would be just another ordinary day, she had no idea that her carefully constructed world of anonymity was about to collide with a force that would refuse to let her remain hidden. The general's keen eye and military experience would soon spot something that others had missed, setting in motion a chain of events that would change not just Maria's life, but the way the military thought about supporting its veterans. The stage was set for a moment of recognition that would remind everyone involved that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden behind the most ordinary facades, waiting for someone with the wisdom and courage to look beyond the surface and see the hero underneath. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Fort Henderson on a crisp Tuesday morning in October, her staff car pulling up to the installation headquarters precisely at 0800 hours. The base commander, Colonel James Mitchell, was waiting with his senior staff to greet the visiting general and begin what would be a comprehensive tour of the facility's operations. General Morrison was known throughout the Army Medical Command for her thorough inspections and her genuine interest in the welfare of soldiers and veterans at every level of service. At 52 years old, General Morrison was an imposing figure who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. She had risen through the ranks over a 28-year career that included deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and various peacekeeping missions around the world. Her experience as a combat surgeon had given her a unique perspective on military medicine and the challenges faced by service members both during and after their military careers. More importantly, she had a reputation for being able to spot things that others missed, particularly when it came to identifying soldiers who were struggling or veterans who weren't receiving the support they deserved. The morning portion of her visit included briefings on base operations, a tour of the medical facilities, and meetings with various department heads. Throughout these activities, General Morrison asked pointed questions about veteran employment programs, mental health services, and transition assistance for soldiers leaving active duty. Her staff noted that she seemed particularly interested in understanding how well the installation was supporting veterans who were working in civilian capacities on the base. Colonel Mitchell had prepared extensively for the visit, ensuring that all facilities were in top condition and that his staff was ready to answer any questions the general might have. The dining facility was scheduled as one of the final stops on the tour, a routine inspection that was expected to be brief and uneventful. Mrs. Patterson, the facility manager, had spent days ensuring that every surface was spotless, all equipment was functioning perfectly, and her staff was prepared to demonstrate the high standards of food service provided to the base community. Maria had been made aware of the general's visit the previous week, along with the rest of the dining facility staff. Mrs. Patterson had held a brief meeting to remind everyone about proper appearance standards, professional conduct, and the importance of representing the facility well during the inspection. For Maria, it was just another reminder to keep her head down and do her job efficiently. She had no particular interest in meeting the general and hoped to blend into the background as she always did. The lunch rush had been particularly busy that day, with more customers than usual coming through the line. Maria had worked steadily through the morning, ensuring that her serving station was fully stocked and properly maintained. She took pride in the fact that she never ran out of popular items and that her area always looked pristine, even during the busiest periods. Her military training had instilled in her a commitment to excellence, even in tasks that others might consider mundane. When General Morrison and her entourage entered the dining facility at approximately 1230 hours, Maria was focused on serving a group of young soldiers who were discussing their upcoming training exercise. She glanced up briefly to acknowledge the arrival of the inspection party but, then, returned her attention to ensuring each soldier received properly portioned servings of the day's featured entrees. Her years of experience had taught her that the best way to handle inspections was to continue doing her job exactly as she always did, without trying to impress anyone or draw attention to herself. General Morrison moved through the facility with her characteristic thoroughness, observing food preparation procedures, checking temperature logs, and speaking with various staff members about their roles and responsibilities. She complimented Mrs. Patterson on the cleanliness and organization of the facility and noted the efficiency of the serving line operations. Her aide, Captain Rodriguez, took detailed notes as they moved through each area, documenting observations that would be included in the post-visit report. As the inspection party approached Maria's station, she was serving a senior officer who was asking about the ingredients in one of the prepared dishes due to food allergies. Maria answered his questions knowledgeably and professionally, demonstrating the kind of customer service that Mrs. Patterson had emphasized during staff training. She was completely absorbed in ensuring the officer received accurate information when she became aware that someone was standing directly in front of her station, waiting patiently for her attention. Looking up, Maria found herself face to face with General Morrison, who was studying her with the kind of intense attention that seasoned military officers reserve for details that have caught their interest. The general's expression was professional but curious, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle or recall something important. Behind her, Colonel Mitchell and Mrs. Patterson were engaged in conversation about meal planning and nutritional requirements, apparently unaware that the general had stopped at Maria's station. "Good afternoon," General Morrison said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried the unmistakable tone of command. "I'd like to try the beef stew, please." Maria nodded and reached for a clean serving spoon, grateful that this appeared to be a routine interaction. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, falling back on the military courtesy that was second nature to her. "Would you like a full portion or would you prefer to try a smaller serving first?" The general's eyes narrowed slightly at Maria's response, clearly noting the automatic military courtesy and precise speaking style that didn't quite match her civilian food service role. "A full portion will be fine," she said, continuing to study Maria carefully. "You handle yourself like someone with military experience." The observation caught Maria off guard, and she felt her carefully maintained composure falter slightly. Yes, ma'am. I served for 12 years before taking this position," she admitted, hoping that would satisfy the general's curiosity and allow her to return to the anonymity she preferred. But General Morrison was far from satisfied. As Maria reached across the serving counter to place the stew on the general's tray, her uniform sleeve rode up slightly, revealing just the edge of her memorial tattoo. It was only visible for a few seconds, but it was enough for the general's trained eye to catch sight of the intricate military-themed artwork that decorated Maria's forearm. The general's entire demeanor changed in that instant. Her casual inspection posture straightened, and her expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention. "That's an interesting tattoo," she said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that suggested this was no longer a routine conversation. "May I ask about its significance?" Maria's heart began to race as she realized that her carefully guarded privacy was about to be invaded. She glanced around nervously, noting that several other staff members and customers were within earshot of the conversation. The last thing she wanted was to become the center of attention or to have to explain her military service and its aftermath to a room full of people. It's a memorial piece, ma'am," she said quietly, hoping to deflect further questioning. "Nothing too significant." But General Morrison was not the type of officer who accepted evasive answers, particularly when she sensed there was an important story being hidden. She moved closer to the serving counter and lowered her voice so that only Maria could hear her next words. "Soldier, I've been in the army long enough to recognize a memorial tattoo when I see one. Those names I glimpsed, they represent real people, don't they? People you served with?" The directness of the question, combined with being addressed as soldier for the first time in months, caused Maria's carefully constructed emotional barriers to crack slightly. She found herself nodding before she could think better of it, her eyes beginning to water as memories of her fallen comrades rushed back to the surface. General Morrison noticed the emotional response immediately and her expression softened with understanding. What was your MOS? She asked gently, using the military acronym for Military Occupational Specialty. 68W, ma'am, Maria replied automatically. Combat Medic. 3 deployments to Afghanistan between 2018 and 2023. The revelation caused the general to pause, her experienced mind immediately understanding the implications of Maria's service record. Combat Medic saw some of the worst aspects of war, dealing with traumatic injuries and impossible decisions under extreme pressure. The fact that one with 3 deployments was now working in a dining facility suggested a story that the general felt compelled to understand. And, how long have you been working here? General Morrison continued, her questions becoming more focused and purposeful. About 8 months, ma'am, Maria answered, unconsciously standing straighter as the familiar rhythm of military question and answer took over. Since March. Colonel Mitchell and Mrs. Patterson had noticed that the general had engaged in an extended conversation with one of the food service workers and had moved closer to listen. Mrs. Patterson looked concerned, worried that one of her employees might be receiving criticism or causing problems during the important inspection. Colonel Mitchell appeared puzzled by the general's intense interest in what should have been a routine interaction. General Morrison seemed to sense the growing attention their conversation was attracting. She looked around the dining facility, noting the curious glances from other customers and staff members, and made a decision that would surprise everyone present. Mrs. Patterson, she called to the facility manager, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. I need to speak with this employee privately. Is there an office or conference room where we could have a brief conversation? Mrs. Patterson looked startled by the request but quickly nodded. Of course, General. We can use my office. It's just down the hall. Excellent, General Morrison replied, then turned back to Maria with an expression that brooked no argument. I'd like you to join me for a few minutes, if you don't mind. Someone else can cover your station. Maria felt a surge of panic at the prospect of a private conversation with a general officer, but she also recognized that this was not really a request. Years of military training had taught her that when a superior officer wanted to speak with you privately, you complied immediately and, without question. She nodded silently and began removing her serving gloves, her mind racing with possibilities about what this conversation might entail. As they walked toward Mrs. Patterson's office, followed by a confused Colonel Mitchell and an increasingly worried facility manager, Maria couldn't help but wonder if she was about to face some kind of disciplinary action. Perhaps the general had heard something about her background that suggested she was unsuitable for her current position. Maybe there were concerns about veterans working in civilian roles on military installations. What she couldn't have anticipated was that General Morrison had already begun formulating a plan that would not only change Maria's life but also serve as a catalyst for broader changes in how the military supported its veterans. The general's keen eye had spotted something that others had missed, a highly skilled and experienced soldier who was underutilized and possibly struggling with issues that the system should have addressed months ago. The private conversation that was about to take place would reveal truths that had been hidden for too long and set in motion events that would remind everyone involved that veterans are valuable assets whose skills and experiences should never be wasted, regardless of the circumstances that led them to their current situations. Mrs. Patterson's office was a modest space decorated with certificates of appreciation, photos from various dining facility events, and a collection of coffee mugs from military installations around the world. As General Morrison closed the door behind them, Maria felt the walls of the small room closing in around her. She remained standing at attention, despite the general's gesture toward one of the chairs facing the desk, her military training taking over in the presence of such high-ranking authority. Please, sit down, General Morrison said gently, settling into the chair behind Mrs. Patterson's desk. This isn't a formal interview or disciplinary action. I just want to understand your story better. Maria reluctantly took a seat, her posture remaining rigid as she struggled to process what was happening. In all her months working at the dining facility, she had successfully avoided drawing attention to herself, and now she was face to face with a general who seemed determined to uncover the very things she had been trying to keep hidden. "Let's start with the basics," the general continued, her voice taking on the patient but persistent tone of an experienced officer conducting a thorough assessment. "You mentioned you were a 68W with 3 deployments to Afghanistan. Can you tell me about your service record? Any special training, awards, or significant experiences I should know about?" Maria hesitated, uncertain about how much she should reveal to someone she had just met. But something in General Morrison's manner suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity, and years of military conditioning made it difficult to avoid answering direct questions from a superior officer. "I enlisted straight out of high school in 2011, she began cautiously. "Completed combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, then, advanced trauma care courses. My first deployment was with the 82nd Airborne in 2018, second with the 10th Mountain Division in 2020, and my final deployment was with a Special Operations Unit in 2022 to 2023. General Morrison's eyebrows raised at the mention of Special Operations. Combat medics who worked with Special Ops units were among the most highly trained and experienced medical personnel in the military, often dealing with complex trauma cases under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Special Operations, the general repeated thoughtfully. That's significant training and responsibility. What kind of cases did you handle? Everything, Maria replied, her voice becoming steadier as she fell into the familiar rhythm of giving a professional briefing. Gunshot wounds, blast injuries, massive hemorrhaging, emergency surgeries in field conditions. I was certified for advanced procedures that most medics never get to learn. Chest tubes, emergency tracheotomies, blood transfusions, pain management for complex injuries. The general leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the scope of Maria's experience. And awards? Recognition for your service? Maria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This was territory she preferred not to discuss, as it inevitably led to questions about why someone with such an impressive service record was working in a dining facility. Bronze Star with V device, Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, Combat Medical Badge, Expert Field Medical Badge, Purple Heart. The Purple Heart caught General Morrison's attention immediately. You were wounded in action? Yes, ma'am. IED blast during my second deployment. Shrapnel to the leg and back. I was treated and returned to duty after 6 weeks of recovery time. And you continued serving for 3 more years after being wounded? Yes, ma'am. The injuries weren't career-ending, and my unit needed experienced medics. I felt it was my duty to continue serving. General Morrison sat back in her chair, processing the information she had just received. Here was a decorated combat veteran with extensive medical training and proven courage under fire, someone who had continued serving even after being wounded, and yet she was working in a food service position that utilized none of her valuable skills and experience. Maria, the general said, using her first name for the first time and softening her tone considerably, help me understand how someone with your background ended up here. Not that there's anything wrong with this work, but it seems like a significant underutilization of your training and abilities. The question hit Maria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the painful realities that had led to her current situation. She felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as memories of her struggle with civilian life came flooding back. It's complicated, ma'am, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The transition out of the military was difficult. Finding work that matched my skills was harder than I expected. The job market for military medics in civilian healthcare is competitive, and my PTSD made interviews challenging. PTSD, General Morrison repeated, her expression becoming even more concerned. Are you receiving treatment through the VA? I tried, Maria replied, her frustration evident in her voice. The wait times were months long, and when I finally got an appointment, they wanted to start me on medications that made it hard to function. I had bills to pay and needed to work, so I stopped going to the appointments and focused on finding employment. The general's jaw tightened as she listened to Maria's account. This was exactly the kind of systemic failure that she had been working to address throughout her career in Army Medical Command. Highly skilled veterans were falling through the cracks of bureaucratic systems that were supposed to support them, ending up underemployed and struggling with issues that proper treatment could address. "Tell me about the memorial tattoo," General Morrison said gently. "The names you carry with you." Maria's composure finally broke completely. Tears began streaming down her face as she thought about her fallen comrades, the soldiers she had been unable to save despite her best efforts. Her voice cracked as she began to speak. "6 soldiers from my last deployment," she managed to say between sobs. "All of them died despite everything I did to save them. Sergeant Martinez was hit by sniper fire while we were evacuating civilians. I worked on him for 40 minutes, but the damage was too extensive. Private Johnson stepped on an IED while we were clearing a compound. I managed to stop the bleeding, but he died from his injuries during the helicopter flight to the field hospital." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to continue with the painful recounting of memories she had tried so hard to suppress. "Corporal Williams died in my arms after taking shrapnel from a mortar attack. I had run out of morphine, and all I could do was hold his hand while he asked me to tell his family he loved them. Specialist Garcia, Sergeant Thompson, and Private Lee all died in the same attack that gave me my Purple Heart. I was unconscious from my own injuries when they were killed, and I've always felt like I abandoned them when they needed me most." General Morrison listened in silence, her own eyes beginning to water as she heard the raw pain in Maria's voice. She had known hundreds of combat veterans throughout her career, and she recognized the symptoms of survivor's guilt and moral injury that often accompanied PTSD in military medical personnel. "Maria," she said softly, "you know that none of those deaths were your fault, don't you? You did everything possible to save them under impossible conditions." "Intellectually, yes," Maria replied, her voice steadying slightly. "But, emotionally, it's hard to accept that. Every day I wake up and they don't, and I can't help but think there was something more I could have done, some procedure I missed, some way I could have saved just one more of them." The general stood up and walked around the desk to sit in the chair next to Maria, her formal command presence giving way to genuine human compassion. "That guilt you're carrying is not yours to bear alone. Those soldiers died because they were in a war zone facing an enemy that wanted to kill them, not because you failed them. From what you've told me about your service record, you saved far more lives than you lost." "That's what the chaplain told me," Maria said with a bitter laugh. "But, knowing it and feeling it are two different things. Every time I try to use my medical skills now, I remember the ones I couldn't save. That's part of why I took this job. It's simple work that doesn't require me to make life or death decisions anymore." General Morrison was quiet for several moments, processing everything she had learned about Maria's situation. Here was a classic case of a valuable veteran who had been let down by the very systems designed to support her transition to civilian life. The military had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in Maria's training and had benefited from her skills and courage for 12 years, but when she needed help adapting those skills to civilian life, the support systems had failed her. "Maria, I want to ask you something important," the general said, leaning forward with an intensity that commanded attention. "If I could arrange for proper mental health treatment and help you find a position that utilized your medical training, would you be interested in getting back into healthcare?" The question caught Maria completely off guard. After months of feeling forgotten and invisible, the possibility that someone in a position of authority might actually help her seemed too good to be true. I don't know," she stammered. "I mean, yes, I miss using my skills, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility again. What if I freeze up? What if I make a mistake because of my PTSD? Those are valid concerns," General Morrison acknowledged. But, there are also concerns that can be addressed with proper treatment and gradual reintegration into medical practice. The Army Medical Command has programs specifically designed to help veterans like you transition their skills into civilian healthcare careers. She paused, then continued with growing conviction. Maria, you represent exactly the kind of veteran we cannot afford to lose to underemployment and inadequate support systems. Your experience, training, and dedication are valuable assets that should be serving patients, not being wasted because bureaucratic systems fail to provide proper transition assistance. Maria felt a spark of hope beginning to kindle in her chest for the first time in months. The idea that someone believed her skills were still valuable, that her experience could still make a difference, was both terrifying and exhilarating. What would that involve? She asked cautiously. First, we get you connected with proper mental health services through a program I personally oversee, General Morrison explained. No waiting lists, no bureaucratic delays. These are counselors who specialize in combat trauma and moral injury, people who understand what you've been through. Second, we look at certification programs that would allow you to use your military medical training in civilian healthcare settings. Emergency room technician, surgical assistant, trauma coordinator, there are multiple paths forward. The general's voice took on a tone of firm determination. Most importantly, we make sure you never feel invisible or forgotten again. The military made a commitment to you when you raised your right hand and took the oath, and that commitment doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Maria sat in stunned silence, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. After months of feeling like a failure, like someone whose best days were behind her, here was a general officer offering not just help, but a path back to the meaningful work that had once defined her life. Why? She finally asked. Why would you go to all this trouble for someone you just met? General Morrison smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Because, soldier, I recognize talent and dedication when I see it. And, because I've learned that sometimes the most important part of leadership is knowing when to help someone remember who they really are underneath the circumstances they're currently facing. The conversation that had begun with a chance observation about a tattoo had become something far more significant, the beginning of a transformation that would not only change Maria's life but also serve as a catalyst for broader improvements in how the military supported its veterans during their transition to civilian life. The weeks following Maria's conversation with General Morrison moved with a swiftness that left her feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. True to her word, the general had immediately set in motion a series of interventions that began to address the systemic failures that had led to Maria's underemployment and struggle with civilian transition. Within 48 hours of their meeting, Maria received a phone call from Dr. Sarah Chen, a clinical psychologist who specialized in combat trauma and worked with a treatment program that General Morrison personally supported. Unlike her previous experiences with VA mental health services, this call resulted in an appointment scheduled for the following week, with no waiting list and no bureaucratic obstacles. Mrs. Patterson had been remarkably understanding about Maria's need for time off to attend medical appointments. After a brief conversation with General Morrison following their meeting, the facility manager had gained a new appreciation for Maria's background and the challenges she was facing. Rather than viewing the medical appointments as an inconvenience, Mrs. Patterson began actively supporting Maria's treatment process, often asking how things were progressing and offering flexible scheduling to accommodate therapy sessions. Maria's first session with Dr. Chen took place in a comfortable office that felt more like a living room than a clinical setting. Dr. Chen was a veteran herself, having served as a Navy psychologist before transitioning to civilian practice, and she immediately understood the military context of Maria's experiences in a way that previous counselors had not. The first thing I want you to understand, Dr. Chen said during their initial session, is that what you're experiencing is not weakness or failure. Combat PTSD, survivor's guilt, and moral injury are normal responses to abnormal situations. You've been trying to carry an enormous emotional burden by yourself, and it's no wonder you've been struggling. The treatment approach was comprehensive and tailored specifically to Maria's needs. Rather than immediately prescribing medications that might affect her ability to work, Dr. Chen began with trauma-focused therapy techniques designed to help Maria process her combat experiences and develop healthier coping mechanisms. They worked together to identify the specific triggers that activated Maria's PTSD symptoms and develop strategies for managing them. One of the most powerful aspects of the therapy was addressing Maria's survivor's guilt directly. Dr. Chen helped her understand that the guilt she felt about surviving when her comrades didn't was a common experience among combat veterans, particularly those in medical roles who felt responsible for saving lives. The reality, Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions, is that you were working in an environment where death was a constant presence despite your best efforts. The fact that you saved many lives doesn't diminish the tragedy of the ones you couldn't save, but it also doesn't make you responsible for deaths that occurred due to the inherent dangers of combat. Through a therapeutic technique called moral injury counseling, Maria began to separate her professional performance as a medic from the outcomes that were beyond her control. She learned to recognize that doing her best under impossible circumstances was all that could reasonably be expected, and that the deaths of her comrades were tragedies of war rather than personal failures. The therapy sessions also included practical components designed to help Maria rebuild confidence in her medical abilities. Dr. Chen worked with her to identify specific scenarios that triggered anxiety about making medical decisions and gradually exposed her to similar situations in controlled, low-stress environments. This process helped Maria realize that her fundamental medical knowledge and instincts were still intact, despite her emotional struggles. Meanwhile, General Morrison had been working behind the scenes to identify career opportunities that would allow Maria to utilize her medical training while providing the support structure she needed during her recovery process. Through her connections in Army Medical Command, the general had learned about a program at Fort Henderson's base hospital that was specifically designed to help military medics transition into civilian healthcare roles. The program, called the Military to Civilian Healthcare Bridge, was a relatively new initiative that provided additional certification training for veterans with military medical experience. Participants could earn credentials as emergency medical technicians, surgical technologists, or trauma center specialists while receiving ongoing support for any transition-related challenges they might be facing. When General Morrison contacted Maria about the program, she was initially hesitant to commit to something that would require her to leave the relative safety of her food service position. The therapy sessions had helped her understand her PTSD better, but the idea of returning to medical work still felt overwhelming. "I understand your concerns," General Morrison said during a follow-up phone call. "But I want you to consider this program because it's specifically designed for people in your situation. You wouldn't be thrown back into high-stress medical situations immediately. Instead, you'd start with basic responsibilities and gradually take on more complex tasks as you rebuild your confidence." The general's persuasive argument was supported by Dr. Chen, who believed that meaningful work utilizing Maria's skills and experience would be an important component of her recovery process. Avoidance of medical work might feel safer in the short term, the psychologist explained, but, in the long run, it could actually reinforce your trauma responses. Gradually re-engaging with medical practice in a supportive environment could be very therapeutic. After several weeks of consideration and continued therapy sessions, Maria decided to apply for the Healthcare Bridge program. The application process was straightforward, and her military medical background made her an ideal candidate. More importantly, the program coordinators were aware of her situation through General Morrison's involvement and were prepared to provide additional support as needed. Maria's last day working in the dining facility was both sad and celebratory. Mrs. Patterson organized a small farewell gathering with the other food service workers, many of whom had come to appreciate Maria's professionalism and dedication even though they had known little about her background. When Mrs. Patterson announced that Maria was leaving to pursue a career in healthcare, several of her co-workers expressed surprise and admiration for her qualifications. "I had no idea you had medical training," said Janet, one of the longtime employees. That's amazing that you're going to be helping people again." The comment struck Maria as particularly meaningful because it reminded her that her identity as a healer and helper was still intact, even though it had been temporarily obscured by her struggles with civilian transition. The Healthcare Bridge program began with 2 weeks of orientation and assessment designed to evaluate each participant's current knowledge and identify any areas that needed refresher training. For Maria, this process was both challenging and validating. While she discovered that some of her knowledge of civilian medical procedures was outdated, her fundamental understanding of trauma care and emergency medicine was not only current but more advanced than many of the program instructors had expected. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the program director, was particularly impressed with Maria's practical experience and problem-solving abilities. "Your military background shows in everything you do," she told Maria after observing her during a simulated emergency exercise. "You have an intuitive understanding of triage and priority setting that many people with years of civilian experience never develop." The program's approach was gradual and supportive, exactly as General Morrison had promised. Maria began by working as an observer in the base hospital's emergency department, watching procedures and familiarizing herself with civilian medical protocols. This allowed her to ease back into the medical environment without the pressure of immediate responsibility for patient care. As her confidence grew, she was given increasingly complex tasks. First, she assisted with basic patient intake procedures and vital sign monitoring. Then, she moved on to helping with minor wound care and medication administration under direct supervision. Each step was carefully monitored not only by medical supervisors but also by program counselors who were trained to recognize signs of stress or trauma response. One of the most significant milestones came 6 weeks into the program when Maria successfully assisted with the treatment of a soldier who had been injured in a training accident. The patient had suffered multiple fractures and lacerations that required immediate stabilization, exactly the type of complex trauma case that had once triggered intense PTSD symptoms for Maria. As she worked alongside the emergency room team, Maria felt her old instincts and training taking over. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she helped control bleeding, monitor vital signs, and prepare the patient for surgery. When the immediate crisis was over and the patient had been stabilized, she realized that she had worked through the entire emergency without experiencing a panic attack or flashback. Dr. Martinez, who had been observing from nearby, approached Maria after the patient had been transferred to surgery. "How do you feel about what just happened?" she asked carefully. Maria took a deep breath, checking her emotional state before responding. "Good," she said with some surprise in her voice. "Really good, actually. It felt like I remembered who I used to be." "You didn't remember who you used to be," Dr. Martinez corrected gently. "You remembered who you still are. The skills and instincts that made you an excellent combat medic are still there. You just needed the right environment and support to access them again." The progress Maria made through the Healthcare Bridge program was remarkable, but it wasn't without challenges. There were still days when memories of her fallen comrades would surface unexpectedly, causing emotional reactions that required her to step away from patient care temporarily. The difference was that now she had a support system in place that understood these reactions and helped her work through them rather than avoiding them entirely. Dr. Chen continued to work with Maria throughout the program, helping her develop strategies for managing trauma responses in medical settings. They practiced grounding techniques that Maria could use if she felt overwhelmed during patient care, and they worked on reframing her understanding of medical mistakes and complications. "The goal isn't to eliminate all emotional responses to medical situations," Dr. Chen explained. "The goal is to manage those responses in a way that allows you to continue functioning effectively while acknowledging the reality of your experiences." General Morrison maintained regular contact throughout Maria's progress through the program, checking in periodically to ensure that the support systems were working effectively and that Maria was receiving the help she needed. More than just professional interest, the general had developed a personal investment in Maria's success that reflected her broader commitment to supporting veterans. During one of their conversations, General Morrison shared her own struggles with the transition from active combat roles to administrative positions. "Every military career involves multiple transitions," she said. "The key is recognizing that seeking help during those transitions is a sign of strength, not weakness. You're not the first soldier to struggle with these issues, and, unfortunately, you won't be the last. But, your willingness to accept help and work toward recovery is making a difference not just for yourself but for other veterans who will benefit from the lessons we're learning through your experience." As Maria neared completion of the Healthcare Bridge program, she began to consider her long-term career goals with a sense of optimism that had been absent from her life for months. The program had not only helped her regain confidence in her medical abilities but had also connected her with a network of healthcare professionals who valued her military experience and understood the unique perspectives she brought to patient care. The transformation was remarkable not just in terms of Maria's professional capabilities but in her overall sense of purpose and self-worth. The invisible food service worker who had been discovered by General Morrison's keen observation had rediscovered her identity as a skilled healthcare professional with valuable contributions to make to her community. But, perhaps most importantly, Maria had learned that her struggles with civilian transition didn't reflect personal failure but, rather systemic gaps in veteran support services that could be addressed with the right interventions and commitment from military leadership. Her story was becoming more than just a personal victory. It was becoming a model for how the military could better support its veterans during their most vulnerable transition periods. 6 months after her chance encounter with General Morrison, Maria Santos stood in the emergency department of Fort Henderson's base hospital wearing scrubs instead of a food service uniform, her newly earned certification as an emergency medical technician prominently displayed on her name badge. The transformation was visible not just in her professional attire but in her entire demeanor. The confidence had returned to her movements, the pride had returned to her posture, and, most importantly, the sense of purpose had returned to her daily work. Her integration into the hospital staff had been remarkably successful, aided by both her exceptional skills and the support system that continued to surround her recovery process. The medical staff had quickly learned to appreciate Maria's unique combination of advanced trauma experience and practical problem-solving abilities, skills that proved invaluable in the high-pressure environment of military emergency medicine. Dr. James Williams, the emergency department chief, had initially been skeptical about hiring a veteran who was still receiving treatment for PTSD. His concerns about potential performance issues in high-stress situations had been completely dispelled within the first month of Maria's employment. Not only did she perform her duties with exceptional competence, but her calm presence during medical emergencies had a positive effect on the entire department. "Maria has an intuitive understanding of emergency medicine that you can't teach in school," Dr. Williams told his colleagues during a staff meeting. "When things get chaotic, she becomes more focused and effective. That's not something you see very often, even among experienced emergency personnel." The observation was particularly meaningful because it reflected how Maria had learned to channel her combat experience into positive outcomes rather than allowing it to be a source of limitation. Through continued therapy sessions with Dr. Chen and practical experience in the emergency department, she had developed the ability to use her heightened awareness and quick decision-making skills as professional assets. One of the most significant tests of Maria's recovery came during a mass casualty event when a training exercise at Fort Henderson resulted in multiple serious injuries. A communications failure had led to a convoy collision that injured 8 soldiers, several critically. The base hospital's emergency department suddenly found itself dealing with the kind of multiple trauma cases that could overwhelm even experienced medical teams. As the injured soldiers began arriving by ambulance, Maria felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and heightened focus that had once characterized her combat medical work. But, instead of triggering panic or flashbacks, the emergency situation activated her professional training and experience in a way that surprised even Dr. Chen, who happened to be at the hospital for a consultation when the casualties arrived. Maria moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, helping to triage patients, assisting with advanced trauma procedures, and coordinating between multiple medical teams. Her military experience proved invaluable in organizing the emergency response, as she naturally understood the importance of clear communication, rapid decision-making, and maintaining calm under pressure. During the height of the emergency, when Dr. Williams was struggling to coordinate treatment for multiple critical patients simultaneously, Maria stepped forward with a suggestion that demonstrated both her medical knowledge and her understanding of military operations. "Doctor, if you set up a field triage system like we used in Afghanistan, we can process these patients more efficiently," she said confidently. "I can help organize the flow and make sure the most critical cases get priority without creating bottlenecks in the treatment process." Dr. Williams, who had never served in the military, immediately recognized the value of Maria's suggestion and asked her to take the lead in organizing the emergency response. Under her guidance, the department processed all 8 casualties efficiently, with all patients stabilized and transferred to appropriate care levels within 2 hours of the first ambulance arrival. The success of the mass casualty response earned Maria recognition throughout the hospital and demonstrated conclusively that her military experience was an asset rather than a liability in civilian healthcare settings. More importantly, it proved to Maria herself that she could handle high-stress medical situations without being overwhelmed by traumatic memories. "Today reminded me why I became a medic in the first place," Maria told Dr. Chen during their session the following week. "It wasn't just about the technical skills or the adrenaline rush. It was about being able to help people during their worst moments, about making a difference when it really matters." General Morrison had continued to monitor Maria's progress throughout her transition into healthcare work, and she was particularly interested in the lessons that could be learned from Maria's successful recovery. The general had become increasingly convinced that Maria's story represented a model for addressing broader issues in veteran transition support. Working with Dr. Chen and the Healthcare Bridge program staff, General Morrison began developing a comprehensive report on Maria's case that could be used to improve transition services for other veterans facing similar challenges. The report detailed not just the interventions that had been successful but also the systemic failures that had initially led to Maria's underemployment and struggle with civilian adaptation. "What we learned from Maria's situation," General Morrison explained to her staff during a briefing on veteran transition issues, "is that the current system often fails to identify veterans who are struggling until they reach crisis points. We need proactive identification and intervention strategies that recognize when skilled veterans are not being utilized appropriately." The success of Maria's case provided powerful evidence for these recommendations when General Morrison presented them to senior military leadership. Rather than abstract policy proposals, she could point to concrete results achieved through targeted interventions and comprehensive support systems. Maria's story began to attract attention beyond Fort Henderson when General Morrison included her case study in presentations at military medical conferences and veteran support symposiums. The compelling narrative of a decorated combat medic who had been rescued from underemployment through proper intervention resonated with military leaders who were grappling with similar issues at installations across the country. At one such conference, Maria was invited to speak about her experience as part of a panel on veteran transition challenges. Standing before an audience of military officers, healthcare professionals, and veteran service organization representatives, she shared her story with a combination of vulnerability and strength that left a lasting impression on everyone present. "6 months ago, I believed that my military service had ended in failure," she told the audience. "I thought that my struggles with civilian transition meant that I was damaged goods, that my best days were behind me. What I learned through this process is that veterans don't fail civilian transition, systems fail veterans. When proper support is provided, veterans can not only succeed but excel in ways that benefit entire communities." Her presentation included specific recommendations based on her personal experience, emphasizing the importance of early intervention, specialized mental health services, and career transition programs that recognize the value of military experience rather than treating it as an obstacle to overcome. The response to Maria's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several military installations requesting information about implementing similar support programs. More importantly, her story helped shift the conversation about veteran transition from one focused on veteran deficiencies to one focused on system improvements. Dr. Chen, who had worked with many combat veterans throughout her career, was particularly struck by the broader implications of Maria's recovery. What we've seen with Maria is that the skills and resilience that make someone an excellent soldier don't disappear when they leave the military, she explained. But those qualities can be suppressed by trauma and inadequate support systems. When we address the trauma properly and provide appropriate support, those strengths can be accessed again. The success of Maria's case led to the expansion of the Healthcare Bridge program at Fort Henderson, with additional funding provided to serve more veterans seeking to transition their military medical experience into civilian healthcare careers. Maria was asked to serve as a peer mentor in the program, helping newly enrolled veterans navigate the challenges she had once faced herself. In this mentoring role, Maria found a new dimension to her sense of purpose. Working with veterans who were struggling with similar issues allowed her to use her experience not just as a source of personal healing but as a tool for helping others overcome their own transition challenges. The most important thing I can tell new program participants, Maria would explain, is that where you are today doesn't determine where you'll be tomorrow. The skills that made you a good soldier are still there, even if they feel buried under trauma and frustration. With the right support and treatment, you can access those strengths again. 1 year after her conversation with General Morrison, Maria had become not just a successful emergency medical technician but a recognized advocate for veteran transition support. Her story had been featured in military publications, veteran service organization newsletters, and healthcare industry journals as an example of what was possible when comprehensive support systems were implemented effectively. The memorial tattoo on her forearm was still there, still carrying the names of her fallen comrades, but its meaning had evolved. Rather than serving primarily as a reminder of loss and guilt, it had become a symbol of honor and motivation. The memory of her fallen comrades now inspired her daily work helping other patients and supporting other veterans rather than paralyzing her with survivor's guilt. General Morrison, reflecting on the chain of events that had begun with her observation of Maria's tattoo, saw the broader implications for military leadership and veteran support. Leadership isn't just about making strategic decisions or managing large organizations, she would tell her staff. Sometimes it's about having the awareness to notice when someone needs help and the commitment to ensure they receive it. The general's intervention in Maria's situation had evolved into a systematic approach to identifying and supporting struggling veterans that was being implemented at military installations across the country. What had started as a personal response to one veteran's situation had become a model for institutional change. Maria's transformation from invisible food service worker to respected healthcare professional and veteran advocate demonstrated that with proper support, veterans could not only overcome transition challenges but become valuable contributors to their communities in ways that honored their service while building meaningful civilian careers. The story that had begun with a chance encounter in a dining facility had become a testament to the power of recognition, intervention, and comprehensive support. It proved that sometimes the most extraordinary outcomes begin with someone simply taking the time to notice and care about the person serving food, the individual behind the uniform, the veteran whose story deserved to be heard and whose potential deserved to be realized. Most importantly, it showed that no veteran should be left to struggle alone with transition challenges, and that the military's commitment to its service members shouldn't end when they take off the uniform but should continue until they find their place in the civilian world, using their skills and experience to serve their communities in new ways while honoring the memory of those who didn't make it home.